Hello, everybody. One of the reasons I started Type 2 and You with Meg is because I wanted to help you feel empowered, supported, informed about type 2 diabetes. I also wanted to make sure that I could combat some of the misconceptions and the stigmas that surround type 2 diabetes. One of the stigmas that I feel is closely linked to type 2 diabetes is the stigma of weight. My guest today is an incredible resource on the research and the information behind weight loss and weight stigma. So who do I have? Christy Harrison. Christy is an anti-diet registered dietitian nutritionist and certified intuitive eating counselor based in New York City. She offers online courses and private intuitive eating coaching to help people all over the world make peace with food and their bodies. Since 2013, Christy has hosted Food Psych, a weekly podcast exploring people's relationships with food and paths to body liberation. It is now one of iTunes' top 100 health podcasts, reaching tens of thousands of listeners worldwide each week. Christy began her career in 2003 as a journalist covering food, nutrition, and health, and she's written for major publications including the New York Times, Self, BuzzFeed, Refinery29, Gourmet, Slate, The Food Network, and many more. Her forthcoming book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, will be published by Little Brown Spark this month in December of 2019 and is available for pre-order now. The links for the pre-order will be in the podcast description, and you can learn more about Christy and her work at christyharrison.com. Because Christy and I had such a great conversation, I divided our discussion into two parts. So today you're listening in to part 1, and the week after Christmas, December 31st, you can tune in to part 2. Let's get started.
Welcome to Type 2 and You with Meg, a diabetes podcast with the tools and guidance you need for your best life with type 2 diabetes. Your host, Megan Munoz, is a Dartmouth-trained health coach and master-prepared certified diabetes educator. She's helped thousands of people turn their diabetes fears, questions, and concerns into hope, confidence, and action. Ready to support your type 2 journey? Here's Meg.
Christy, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Meg.
One of the first things I wanted to start out with was about your new book. So you have a new book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating. And that's coming out in December, correct?
That is right. Just about 2.5 weeks now that, at the time we're recording this.
And I know you can get it on Amazon because mine's been sitting there waiting to be sent to me for a couple of months. But you could also go to christyharrison.com and get it there, correct?
That is right. Yeah, christyharrison.com/book is the direct page.
Okay, and I'll make sure that link's in the podcast description. What do you think is the biggest takeaway out of your book, or the biggest thing you want people to walk away with?
I guess the biggest thing I want people to walk away with is just sort of the macro level is that diet culture is a thing, that it exists, that it's this system of beliefs we've all been taught and indoctrinated into since birth. And, it's not the truth, capital T, right? It's actually just a system of beliefs with a really interesting history that came out of fat phobia and racist ideas about body size and sexist ideas about body size that are really harmful and toxic to people's well-being. And so we need to question that. We need to question all the tenets of diet culture and reject it in favor of something that actually helps our well-being.
So just more than food. It's this whole kind of belief system.
Yeah, it's this whole belief system that is, diet culture, as I define it, is a system of beliefs that demonizes some foods while elevating others, but it also holds smaller bodies up as better than larger bodies. It stigmatizes larger bodies and promotes weight loss as a means of attaining higher status, both moral status and health status, and really oppresses people who don't match up with its supposed picture of health. So, it's about a lot more than the food. It really affects people's relationships with food because I think beliefs about bodies and weight and size certainly underlie a lot of what people do with food. But it's not just about, allowing yourself to eat all foods and giving up dieting and everything is great. It's like, in order to get to that place, in order to get to the place where you feel comfortable and safe giving up dieting and allowing yourself to eat all foods and getting back to the intuitive eating skills we were all born with, you need to dismantle this belief system of diet culture that you've internalized, that we've all internalized, so that you can feel okay, doing something different than what diet culture is telling you.
Because it is so ingrained, what are some of the thoughts and the language that we wouldn't even recognize as diet culture that you have come to gauge or understand? Okay, this is kind of a trap that we fall into very easily. Do you know what I mean?
So many of those like subtle little things. Yeah. So, calling some foods bad and others good, or in less overtly moralized terms, but still moralized, healthy and unhealthy, or processed and whole, right? Like all of these different ways of talking about food can be very rooted in diet culture, are very rooted in diet culture, I would say. In addition to ways of talking about weight, right? Like, oh, I really need to lose weight for my health. That's a diet culture belief that actually, as I outline in the book with a lot of science and sort of in-depth reporting, it's really not true that you need to lose weight in order to improve your health. When it comes to diabetes, right? I know that talking about food in certain ways, saying carbs are bad or like demonizing carbs is really common because, it's true that people with diabetes have a harder time handling carbohydrates because of the way that their bodies function. But that doesn't mean these foods are bad or off limits, or that you need to cut carbs out of your life in order to control your diabetes. And I know these days there's this poisonous diet culture belief that if you cut carbs, you can quote unquote reverse your diabetes and get off all your medications.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really harmful because it destroys people's relationships with food. And I've seen it do that so often.
I would agree with you 100%. And I think that idea of reversing type 2 diabetes, I'm actually just finishing up the last 2 podcasts here in December that have already released, but talking about some of the research behind that, and that the foundation really is very unstable on that idea of reversing type 2 diabetes. So I just think we just float that around way too easily. There's so many flaws in that research behind reversal.
So many flaws. And it doesn't, account for people's mental health, for their overall well-being. It doesn't think about, well-being in a holistic sense. There's this idea like you can get off your meds, you can do it all without medication, because medication has side effects, of course. And especially with insulin, like injectable insulin, it's hard. It sucks to have to inject yourself with needles. I get it. And there are huge side effects to trying to quote unquote reverse it with food, reverse your diabetes with food. And I think in many cases, and, certainly for all the people I've spoken with about this, the risks outweigh the benefits when it comes to trying to do it with food, or trying to do it with food and exercise. That people actually do better, in my experience, when they have a more balanced, sort of reasonable, less aggressive way of relating to food and their bodies, and maybe take medication as well, oral or insulin, along with other non-medication changes they can make.
Yes, and in the world of diabetes, the idea of medication has been very vilified, even though 85% of the people with diabetes take medication. But yeah, so there's just been like some really vilified things and some really idealized things, and I think it really sets people up for that guilt, shame kind of dialogue that happens with diabetes anyway. So It's a very tough cycle. That leads me to one of the questions I had for you. Weight loss is one of the most prescribed treatment plans. That's the way we talk about diabetes. It's written in a lot of our guidelines. What's not in the headlines? You mentioned stuff about the risks outweigh the benefits. What do people with diabetes not get to hear about weight loss?
Oh, so much. I think, the main thing that people with diabetes don't get to hear, and that really everyone doesn't get to hear enough, is that weight loss, intentional weight loss, doesn't work for the vast majority of people. Up to 98% of people end up regaining all the weight that they lost within 5 years. Up to 2/3 of people end up gaining more weight than they lost. And so, it's often the case that people end up weight cycling their way up the scale and then blaming themselves more and more each time and thinking that it's their fault, that if they had only been able to stick to the diet, it would have worked, it would have been sustainable. When in fact, the problem is that the human body fights it. It fights weight loss at every turn. And in fact, we're not designed to stick to diets. Our bodies push us off the diets. They push us to regain weight, in some cases, even when we still are following the diet to the letter. I've spoken with many people who were extremely controlled and used a lot of force and willpower and self-punishment to try to stick to these very austere diets and still ended up regaining weight because the body has all these built-in biological mechanisms to make sure that we don't starve, to make sure that we stay alive in situations of famine. And that's really what your body perceives a diet to be. You know, your body perceives diet and restriction in the amount of food that you're eating or the types of food that you're eating to be a situation of famine. So people, end up regaining all the weight that they lost through these biological mechanisms like hunger hormones being increased, fullness hormones being decreased, decreases in their basal body temperature, decreases in the amount of physical activity that people want to do or have the drive to do, turning off or turning down hormonal function, which is something that a lot of people who diet and lose weight will often experience is they start having menstrual irregularities or they start having erectile dysfunction or other hormonal problems. And they think that they now have another problem they have to deal with by cutting out food or restricting what they eat. And in fact, the problem is that when the body is sensing danger in the form of famine, sensing that there's not enough energy coming in, it shuts down or turns down reproductive function so that it can conserve energy. Because, in a time of famine, it's not a real benefit to reproduce, right? It's actually better to conserve energy to survive. And so, people end up making things worse inadvertently for themselves, and doctors inadvertently end up making things worse too when they prescribe restrictive diets to people with hormonal abnormalities or, any of the other issues that often come up with dieting, like fatigue, listlessness, brain fog, dry skin, constipation, acne, other digestive issues, hair falling out, being cold all the time, all these different things that can be the result of starvation, even though we don't tend to think of diets as starvation. And, people think, well, I'm still eating food. I'm not starving. So how could I possibly be having these effects of starvation? But what's really interesting about starvation is that it does not mean a total absence of food. It just means less food than your body really needs in order to function. There was a seminal study done in the late 1940s called the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, where people were put on what the researchers called a semi-starvation diet because it met just over half of their calorie needs. And what they found was that the results were incredibly profound. They were results consistent with famine, full-on starvation, even though these people were still eating a fair amount of food. They were still eating multiple meals a day. They were still eating half of what they needed, but it wasn't enough. And, we know from that and from so much other research that when people are on diets, their bodies experience this starvation-like response that, gears them toward weight regain and therefore survival. And so people just don't hear that when they're told to lose weight. These recommendations for diabetes, for weight loss, just don't take into account the astronomical failure rate of diets. And moreover, the fact that when people weight cycle, which is, the yo-yo of weight loss and regain that most people experience on diets, because again, up to 98% of the time, people don't lose weight and keep it off long term. Weight cycling, that weight loss and regain, actually has its own independent negative health effects. It's actually associated with a lot of the things that we commonly blame on weight itself, like diabetes, heart disease, some forms of cancer, mortality risk. Right? So all of these things that weight takes the blame for that can be explained largely, if not entirely, by weight cycling. And the other thing that can explain a lot of these, increased health risks we see among people in larger bodies is weight stigma. the discrimination against and denigration of people in larger bodies in our society, and the chronic stress and toll that that takes on the body, because it really is stressful to be stigmatized. And we have a lot of research showing that people who are stigmatized for whatever reason, racism, sexism, fat phobia, what have you, have higher levels of chronic inflammation, have higher risks for all kinds of chronic diseases. And we see in experimental data as well that when people are exposed to weight stigmatizing interventions, their cortisol levels go up. Their cortisol level, cortisol is the stress hormone. So their stress levels go up in response to weight stigma. And the people who have greater internalized weight stigma already, meaning that, probably have experienced more of it in their life and like taken it in as part of their self-identity, those folks, their levels of cortisol stays chronically elevated from experiences of weight stigma. So, we know from that stigmatizing people for their weight, telling them they need to lose weight, which is a form of weight stigma because it says your body is wrong now and you need to lose weight in order to fix it. That's actually adding to people's problems. That's actually increasing their health risks. And we know that weight loss is not sustainable, is not good for the body. It actually puts the body at greater risk via weight cycling. And so we really need another way. We really need to stop telling people with diabetes and people in general to lose weight for their health, because it's just not a proven fact. It's just not scientifically valid.
I think you hit the nail on the head as far as that weight stigma piece, because I think that diabetes shields that a lot. I listened into a weight neutral symposium because I thought, gosh, I just really want to be able to help the people I see in a way that doesn't make them feel even more guilty than they already feel with diabetes. But I think that I didn't realize to what degree that weight, sorry, I'm going to tear up. I always tear up when I talk about this, but because I contributed to that for some people. Just not knowing and not thinking I'm following the guidelines, and I look and I think these poor people, they've tried and they're doing everything they possibly can, or they're heavier and they come in, they feel very guilty about being diagnosed with diabetes, and they're barely eating and they're sitting across from me with tears in their eyes. And after you see so many people like that, you think, gosh, there's got to be a different way to support someone. And so just learning more about the weight neutral approach and focusing on healthy behaviors rather than on someone's appearance has just been such an eye-opening and wonderful experience. And I just think the world of diabetes, it covers up a lot of the weight stigma. It's just an acceptable piece of how we treat diabetes. I want to make sure I understand this and that people understand this with diabetes, that when we talk about insulin resistance, we always say, if you're heavier, you have more insulin resistance. But people that weight cycle, so they drop weight and then it comes back on, and they drop it and it comes back on, that insulin resistance piece actually compounds, right? They actually have more insulin resistance every time they gain their weight back. Is that right?
Right. And I mean, every time they weight cycle too. So it's not even necessarily the, higher weight is the outcome of that, but the cycling itself seems to be, put people on the path to insulin resistance. And yeah, that is such a an overlooked point in diabetes. And I so empathize with you for feeling, sad and having it be so painful. And I've had that experience as well of feeling like I've done harm, and that these guidelines that we were taught in school and, to become healthcare providers are the things that we're trying to carry out because we think that's the way to help people. And to see those guidelines do so much harm is just heartbreaking, because we thought we were doing the right thing and we didn't, we harmed people. And that's, I think a lot of us as healthcare providers have to reckon with that, have to reckon with the harm we've done and have to apologize to the people we've hurt. And I'm so sorry for all the people that I hurt before I knew better, and now that I know better, I'm trying to do better. And it sounds like you are too, that we learn, we can't know what we don't know until we find out, and this is not something that is taught in schools. And yeah, that, the fact that weight cycling increases insulin resistance, and chronic inflammation and a whole host of other disease risks, and that weight stigma increases those risks as well, and that telling people to lose weight is a form of weight stigma is just not something we're ever taught. And diet culture makes it so opaque and so difficult to learn all of that, that it really is a miracle any of us come out of that, you know?
Yeah, I think you're right. That it does take some time and just exposure to people, and then when you see it not working for people,
Mhm.
you start recognizing that there has to be a different way of approaching people and helping them with their health. So if somebody's listening and they're thinking, okay, if weight loss isn't the key, what is the key? What do people focus on, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think, my opinion is really informed by the health at every size philosophy, which says that, we can help people engage in health promoting behaviors to the extent that they desire and have, the capacity to do that without having weight loss be on the table anywhere at all, because weight loss is not a health promoting behavior for all those reasons we just talked about. Right. But there are other health promoting behaviors out there that do help and that have been shown to work. Right. So, I'm hesitant though to jump into those without saying that first and foremost, I think it's important for people to heal their relationships with food and exercise, because so many people, and especially people with diabetes who've been so stigmatized for their weight and also for their disease, had really, really painful relationships with food, have had really difficult experiences where they've been told to restrict. I've seen so many people like you who come in eating almost nothing and just banging their head against the wall saying, I don't know what else I can do to manage my diabetes. And people in that situation where you're in starvation mode, where you've so internalized diet culture thinking that you're really restricting your food intake, I think you need time to heal from that. You need time to make peace with food, to learn to honor your hunger again, to learn to, open up to pleasure in food and satisfaction, not just thinking about nutrition, but thinking about what you actually enjoy, really rejecting the diet mentality and diet culture thinking that led you to that place of restriction before you can even get to a place where you're able to think about gentle nutrition principles and joyful movement and exercise in a way that's going to be beneficial and health promoting rather than punishing. Because I think when people come in with the diet culture mentality, any sort of nutrition or physical activity advice can easily be twisted into, in the service of diet culture, into another rule, another tool to bludgeon yourself with. And that's not the goal, right? The goal is to have sustainable long-term health and to have the ability to engage in health promoting practices and behaviors long term without having it turn into this push and pull, this swing on the pendulum from the side of restriction and holding tight, you're holding onto your health with an iron fist to inevitably having to let go because you can't sustain that, and then swinging over to the side of feeling out of control. That's what so many people experience. I know so many people listening probably have had that experience with dieting and weight loss where they felt like they were doing it right and engaging in so much willpower, and then inevitably that slipped because it has to, because again, that those biological mechanisms we were talking about really push you back to the place where your body wants to be. And so then, they end up swinging to this place of feeling out of control, feeling like they don't have any handle on their health. Maybe they're binging, maybe they're not exercising or moving at all, and feeling, like rebellious against any of that. And I just want to say, like, that swing on the pendulum is so normal and so understandable when you've been restricted. And when you're swinging on a pendulum like that, you can't just land in that peaceful place in the middle of stillness without swinging back and forth in order to get there, right? So when you've been on that side of restriction, inevitably there's going to be this sort of propulsion oftentimes to the side of like wanting to eat all the foods that were previously off limits, wanting to say, screw it, I don't want to exercise because it's so punishing and I don't like it. Not wanting to prioritize your health. And that's a very normal part of the process. And so it's common, I think, for people when they start trying to engage in intuitive eating and the health at every size and anti-diet approach, that they swing over to that side of the pendulum, or they're like, let it all go, like don't want to engage in health at all right now. And then they get scared and they end up going back over to the side of restriction because that's all they know. But I want to tell you that like it's normal to go through that feeling of wanting to stay away from those health promoting behaviors, supposedly health promoting behaviors that were prescribed to you in the past, and feeling a sense of innate rebellion against that. But then eventually, if you can get through that period, if you can allow that to happen and just have some faith and some grace that you will move through it in time, eventually you really will get to that place of stillness and peace where you can then start thinking about, okay, what are some gentle nutrition practices maybe I could bring into play that would help me manage my diabetes? Or what are some physical activity practices I can engage in to help manage diabetes? Because we know that that's helpful for reducing insulin resistance, right? And so, there's tools that we can use eventually, and also medication is another tool, right? Making sure that you're on the correct dose of medication, making sure that you're on the correct type of medication for your body. All of that is part of self-care with diabetes and non-diet diabetes management. But I think it's important to just let yourself have permission to go through that messy middle ground where it might not feel as easy and where you're really, working at and striving for greater peace with food, but you're not quite there yet. That's a scary place to be, but it's also a really necessary step to go through.
That rounds out part 1 of my discussion with Christy Harrison. But come back in 2 weeks on December 31st and listen in to the second portion of our discussion, including Christy's takeaways. If you're interested in Christy's online courses, her podcast, Food Psych, or her upcoming book, check out the links in the podcast description. You can also go to ChristyHarrison.com or follow any of her social media handles. Again, all of that will be in the podcast description for part 1 and part 2 of my discussion with Christy Harrison. I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas holiday, and don't forget, the number one thing you can do to manage your diabetes is bet on you.
Keep current on new episodes by subscribing to Type 2 and You with Meg. Be sure to share a link of today's episode to someone you know living with Type 2 diabetes. Want to learn more about today's topic or need answers to your diabetes dilemmas? Contact Megan by using the links in the podcast description or visiting her webpage, type2andyou.org. This podcast is for informational purposes only and not intended as medical advice.